When I was 16 years old, in 1993, one of the many now defunct teen magazines gave me a plum assignment to go to Washington, D.C., and write about the newly opened United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
As we have seen already today, this museum is not for the dead alone, nor even for the survivors who have been so beautifully represented. It is perhaps most of all for those of us who were not there at all, to learn the lessons, to deepen our memories and our humanity, and to transmit these lessons from generation to generation.
The museum's opening was a grand event, covered in the national media.
More than 10 years in the making, built by private funds on federal land, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has just opened to the public.
And the American Jewish community was very thrilled about it.
It's an incredible tribute, okay? They've done it incredibly well.
This place just makes you become the history that it portrays.
The opening of this massive museum just off the National Mall felt like a sort of debutante party, a monumental, symbolic moment of a broad American acceptance and respect for the Jewish experience. The fact that this supposedly Jewish museum was devoted to describing how Jews were murdered was disturbing if you really thought about it. But back then, it actually felt kind of hopeful. The belief was that people would go to this museum and see where hating Jews could lead. And then, obviously, they would stop hating Jews. I wrote a rave review of that new Holocaust museum, which the teen magazine published between a list of makeup tips and an article about bulimia. In my review, I spent a lot of time praising the museum's children's section, an exhibit called Daniel's Story. The exhibit tells the story of an imaginary child named Daniel, and museum visitors walk through different places from Daniel's life. First, you enter a mock-up of Daniel's house in Frankfurt, Germany, which looks a lot like a house in any American suburb.
We lived in a house with a yard, and I had my own bedroom. Those were happy times for me and my friends.
You see Daniel's soccer cleats and his soccer ball on a shelf in his room, next to his globe and his camera. Daniel's dad was a war veteran, so you see his dad's army medals too. Just past the cookies in Daniel's kitchen and the teddy bear on Daniel's bed, you move on to a street full of vandalized storefronts and signs that say "No Jews Allowed." In the next room, you're in a ghetto, where Daniel's fancy house has been replaced with a small and shabby room.
We were trapped. There were rules about everything. My family lived together in one small room. We thought it couldn't get worse than the ghetto, but it did.
And by the next room, you're at Auschwitz. But this is a kids' exhibit, so it stops at the barbed wire. At the end, you're encouraged to write a note to the imaginary Daniel, telling him what you've learned. As a recent child myself, I found all this quite moving. And in 1993, I still believed in the power of dead Jews to protect living ones, a belief that's actually rooted in the theology of Judaism itself. I was convinced that writing about this exhibit would help people recognize the Jews' humanity, just like the museum itself would. I couldn't imagine anything objectionable about this. So I was shocked when a random Holocaust survivor attacked me for it. When I returned from Washington, my parents took me to see some friends of theirs, and everyone was eager to hear about the brand new museum that they'd only seen on TV. I gave them my rave review, especially of the children's exhibit. One of the other guests was an older woman who I didn't know. Like many old Jews back then, she had a heavy accent and a bunch of numbers on her arm. She glared at me until I stopped talking. Then she said, "A kid on a soccer team? is not what died in the Holocaust. Then she started ranting about Yiddish-speaking culture, about books and theaters and yeshivas and newspapers and Hasidic dynasties and political parties and youth groups and musicians and artists and writers I'd never heard of. She shrieked at me about how I had to tell my teenage readers about what was really lost. Why, she demanded, did the museum have a soccer-playing German-speaking kid as its emblem of the children who were murdered in the Holocaust, when 85% of Holocaust victims were Yiddish speakers and a huge percentage were religious Jews? Instead of soccer cleats, why didn't the boy's bedroom shelves have his volumes of the Talmud? Or his scouting uniform from his socialist youth club? Or his Hebrew songbooks from the Zionist group Hashomer HaTzair? Instead of his dad's army medals, why not Dad's tefillin? Or Dad's Yiddish newspapers? Or his tickets to the Yiddish theater? Was there even a mezuzah on the door of Daniel's imaginary house? I recently checked. There isn't. The woman kept ranting at me, but I was 16 and I had no patience for cranky old people. Instead of listening, I politely told this Holocaust survivor that she was completely wrong. What mattered most in a museum like this, I patiently explained, was that regular American children could relate to it. The whole point was to teach American kids that kids who died in the Holocaust were just like them. Then the woman shouted at me, "But what if they weren't just like them? Would it have been okay to murder them if they weren't just like them?" That old woman's question made me so uncomfortable that I avoided it for 25 years.